Hello, my name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to today's program, Warrior Women of the Past. We're delighted to welcome back our presenter, Ellen Green, who's joining us from London. The library is grateful to the Friends of the Glencoe Public Library for supporting this visiting professors event. You're welcome to put your questions for our presenter into the chat or the Q&A, and I will ask them on your behalf when Ellen concludes her slideshow. Before we get started, I'm going to put a one question poll up on your screen to see how many people we have with us today. I appreciate you letting me know. Again, thank you all for being here today, and please let me tell you about our presenter. After working as a field archaeologist in London for 5 years, Ellen has returned to academia. She's working on a PhD at the University of Reading. She specializes in bioarchaeology with a focus on human and animal remains found in odd places during the late Iron Age and early Roman periods in England. This is her 5th time presenting at this library, and she's here today to tell us about the historical evidence for fierce females and how modern archaeologists are bringing their stories to light. Ellen, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Grace, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to In Search of the Amazons, Warrior Women of the Past. I'm specifically mainly going to be talking about women in the Iron Age and sort of before the Iron Age, because that's my period of interest. And I just wanted to say a few words about this particular talk and why it's so important to me. So anybody who has met me in person will know this, but I have been doing some form of sword fighting since I was 11. I do sport fencing, I do historical fencing, I've done stage fighting, I've done reenactment fighting, and throughout all of this, especially with the historical stuff, there's always one guy that gives me a weird look and goes, women don't fight. And so I am delighted to bring the receipts, as it were, and talk about historically how true that statement is. So first of all, let's talk about women in myth and legend, because mythology is absolutely full of warrior women. Not only do we have warrior women like the Amazons, so this is the Amazon queen Melianthe, hunting lions from a Byzantine mosaic in Turkey. This is another depiction of an Amazon, riding a horse into battle. We've got the Valkyries in Viking mythology, who go and collect the spirits of the worthy dead from the battlefield, and this is a pendant of a Valkyrie found in Denmark. It's 9th century common era, and she's got her sword and her shield, but she hasn't sacrificed any of her femininity. She's still in a dress. She's got long hair, very clearly a female figure. But we've also got tons of goddesses of war. If you think of gods of war in antiquity, a surprising number of them are female, considering that we're always told that battle is a purely masculine thing. You've got Athena in ancient Greece and Minerva in ancient Rome. You've got Andraste in Britain. You've got the Morrigan in Ireland. You've got Sekhmet in Egypt, and Ishtar and Astarte in the Near East. That is just the ones I can list off the top of my head. The more you research it, you see the deeper this rabbit hole goes. But conventional wisdom is that women fighting is just a myth. It's a mythology-based thing. So let's, I think it's time we start to re-examine the actual historical evidence and how true those statements are, because a lot of mythology you find often has some basis in reality. So I think a really important place to start when you're looking at any examination of the past is what assumptions are being made and why are they being made. So I found this picture just by Googling recreation of the Ice Age. It's a rather nice picture. I'm sure it was painted for a textbook or a museum somewhere. I've put a lot of thought into it. There's a lot of different activities going on. But let's do a little experiment, shall we? Let's count how many women there are in this picture. So I could only find 2, but there are an awful lot of men. Now, an Ice Age society would, barring any unforeseen selection pressures, be 50-50, because that is how genetics works, you know? So the fact there are only 2 women and more than 3 times the number of men is an interesting choice artistically. And now let's look at what everybody's doing. So we've got this woman here who is processing a skin, and we've got this woman here who is sewing and also looks like she's watching the kids. The men, you've got some that are collecting wood, you've got one that's making fire, you've got some that are dealing with this big elk they've killed, and they got the kids watching on and learning how to hunt. You've got some guys doing flint knapping and making tools, and then you've got this guy who's just standing there with his bow and arrow supervising. They're all doing quite active things. The women, not so much. They're doing very sort of domestic things. They've already been put in this sphere of sort of domesticity, emphasizing things that we would expect women to be doing, you know, in the 19th century: sewing, making clothing, watching the children. Does it surprise you to learn that we actually don't have any evidence for what gender roles were in the Ice Age? It's a very difficult thing to approach from an archaeological point of view. These things don't necessarily leave any sort of trace for us to look at. We know that some of the cave paintings are done by women, and that's about where our knowledge of this stuff begins and ends. These assumptions that we make are very much based on mainly Victorian, because that is when archaeology was sort of born as a subject, ideas of what men and women are doing. To them, it was obvious that a woman's natural place is in the home. You wouldn't, you know, women obviously would have been there, but they're not important. You don't need to worry about them. I mean, there are more children than women in this picture. And we need to be very aware that when we look at the past, what we're assuming and why we're assuming it. So how do we start to address this problem? It's actually really complicated. It's not an easy thing to deal with. So in the early days of archaeology, when you found a grave, if you wanted to decide if it was a man or a woman, you looked at what they were buried with. So these are both Anglo-Saxon artifacts, and they would have been deterministic of gender in the past. This is a spindle whorl. It's used as part of the weaving process. It's quite a nice one. It's beautifully decorated. But it's textiles. And again, it's very much associated with the domestic sphere. So again, spindle whorl must be a woman. This is a spear. Fighting is very masculine, of course. So if there's a weapon, it must be a man. And this was done really up until the 80s. Now, in the 80s, bioarchaeology, which is what I do, started to sort of come into its own as a subject, and people went, hey, skeletons, we can look at those. They might tell us something. And at first, that seems to very neatly solve the problem, because male and female pelvises are different. There are some people that will claim you can do sex estimation from the skull. I am personally quite dubious about that. But certainly the pelvis, women's pelvises tend to be designed for giving birth. Well, I say women's, people with 2 X chromosomes, because sex and gender, also not the same thing, just to make things complicated. Archaeologically, we can look at sex. Sex is biologically determined. Sex is determined by your chromosomes and which hormones your body produces, and that's what makes its changes in your skeleton, and that's something archaeologists can identify. Although again, it's not a simple one-to-one. When we are doing sex estimation in skeletons, there are actually 5 categories. There's female, probably female, indeterminate, probably male, and male. And it is a known problem in bioarchaeology that, for instance, postmenopausal women often have very masculine looking skeletons, and that young boys often have very feminine looking skeletons. And that's without getting into the fact that gender, a culture's idea of what it means to be a man or woman, is not something we can recognize archaeologically, really, because so much of that is down to the ideas and opinions of the people making up a culture. And we know from ethnographic examples and from historical examples that lots of societies don't necessarily have a strict binary of male and female. There are often other categories, which makes the whole thing very complicated. So while I'm going to be talking about these female warriors, do keep in mind, I'm talking about their biological sex. We don't know how their societies would have viewed them in terms of gender roles, in most cases, because that's the sort of thing you can find out through literary evidence, but it is almost impossible, again, archaeologically. Okay, so now we've discussed looking at a body and deciding if it's male or female. There's another part of this equation. How do we know they're a warrior? Because that's not terribly easy either. You know, you're looking at a dead body, you can't just ask them. And I'm going to talk about the sort of three strands of evidence, and I'm going to start with my favorite, which is osteology. So I am an osteologist. I am entirely biased. I think the skeleton is one of the best sources of information about the past that we have, because the way you live your life is reflected in your bones. It's not just how you die. So this is the grave of a woman from Armenia, from the sort of between the 8th to the 6th century BCE. She was between 20 and 29 when she died. And she was buried in a really nice, rich grave with weapons. Now, her bones are interesting because when you work out, when you build muscle, because of the way muscles attach to your bones get more robust. You can actually see where the muscles attach on bone, and the more muscle you have, the bigger those attachment sites are, right? So she has an incredibly muscular arm, and she has incredibly muscular legs. Interestingly about the arms, though, they're uneven. There's a lot of muscle built up on one side and not the other. So while it's very difficult to say exact activities using biomechanics, because again, the human body, lots of complicated things, not always one for one, it's looking very much like she was doing a lot of archery and she was doing a lot of horseback riding, which fits of what we know about the people that were occupying Armenia in this time period, which is the Scythians, who were a nomadic horseback culture who had absolutely amazing bow technology. So she's clearly working out. She's young. But we should also look at how she lived and how she died. So this is her femur. This is the bottom of the top of your leg. This is where the knee joint is. This is the back of the knee. As you can see on that x-ray, there is a little metallic lump. That's an arrowhead. And that has healed. The bone has started to heal around it. You can see by the sort of rounded edges in this picture. She was shot in the back of the knee. This is a reconstruction of how they think it happened, because it's a bit of a weird place to be shot, and she survived it. Equally, there's a fracture on her clavicle that was very well healed, which you can see in this picture here. Breaking your clavicle is statistically the most common injury from horseback riding. So again, that's been used to suggest, that she's living a very equestrian lifestyle. So this woman has been in fights before and she's survived them. But how did she die? Well, not pleasantly. Certainly not of old age at between 20 and 29. Every single one of these red marks on this picture is a cut mark, and you can actually see somebody has sliced her pelvis there. There's a stab mark here in the tibia. And there's a big hole here in the top of the femur. This has been reconstructed. They think it was swords and axes, and they think because the blows came from many directions, she was fighting multiple opponents when she died. So it looks like she died in battle. So I think it's pretty unambiguous that this woman from Armenia was a warrior. But what do you do when you don't have the body? So we do have writing for a lot of the ancient world. A lot of it, you have to keep in mind, is somewhat biased because only certain societies wrote things down, and they're often writing about outsiders, but it does provide evidence. So Boudicca, who I'm going to talk about now, was queen of the Iceni, which was a tribe in Britain. She was not real happy when the Romans invaded, to put it mildly. Though initially their ally, they tried to cheat her out of land by basically saying women can't inherit. So that's ours now, which, yeah, she had some issues with that. And she led the largest full-scale rebellion against Rome that happened in Britain. She burned 3 cities to the ground, including London. And I have dug the Boudiccan destruction layer in London. You can see it archaeologically. There's a layer of ash about that thick that dates to about 60 BCE, no, 60 CE, which is when she was meant to have burned the city. So it all matches up. And Tacitus writes this excellent scene in his histories in which she's giving a speech to her troops. She's driving in her chariot with her daughters and she's giving a speech, and she says, "This is not the first time the Britons have been led to battle by a woman." Now, Tacitus never went to Britain, but his dad did fight in this campaign. And while there is absolutely no way Tacitus did not make this speech up, because there's no way any Roman would have heard Boudicca's speech to her troops, a lot of the points he stresses are worth listening to. Britons being led to battle by women, women fighting. These would have been very foreign ideas to the Romans to some extent, although there is some evidence of women in the Roman army, and I will get to that in a bit. And I think it is worth thinking about why these ideas are the ones that Tacitus is emphasizing. Now, we don't have Boudicca's body. Depending on which account you read, there are 2 main ones, Tacitus and Cassius Dio. She either died of a broken heart or poisoned herself after the Romans defeated her army in battle. We don't know where she's buried. We don't actually have any archaeological evidence of her other than the destruction that her rebellion sort of caused, which we've got ample evidence for in the form of destruction layers in Colchester and London. So sometimes we have writing, sometimes we can look at the skeletons themselves, and sometimes we look at grave goods. This is probably the oldest and most traditional way of assessing somebody's status in a society. But again, it's a really complicated one. The dead don't necessarily bury themselves. Well, I mean, they don't. That's not even a necessarily. People are buried by their community, or in most cases. And what is in a grave is not a one-to-one. We know, because we have found children buried with weapons they could not have possibly have used in some cases, that sometimes weapons can be symbolic, and there are plenty of kings who have been buried in full regalia with arms and armor who never fought in life. So we do have to sort of think about why the graves have what they do and look at big features, the sort of cultural context around it. I would argue that working with all 3 strands of evidence gives you the best result, but this is a wonderful example of a grave, and the first in what will be a theme of this talk, in graves that were identified as belonging to warrior kings, and then it turned out the real story was not quite that simple. So this is And I very much apologize for my pronunciation. This is a place name I've only ever seen written down, and I don't speak Romanian, so I'm sure I'm butchering it, but Agagoil, which is in eastern Romania. And in 1931, they found this really fabulous tomb, and it is so wealthy. You have this beautiful, beautiful helmet with gold inlay, all this detailing. The body was wearing greaves, which are armor you wear over your lower leg, which again, really beautifully detailed to look like people. Tons of gold, tons of jewelry, and tons of weapons. There were 100 of these little guys. They are tribulite arrowheads. They have 3 barbs. They are very nasty, and they're not used for hunting. They are designed for killing people on the battlefield. It's a bit like if you found somebody buried with armor-piercing rounds, you wouldn't assume they're shooting deer. So recently, this 4th century grave, they decided to take another look at the bones, and lo and behold, it turned out, at least sex-wise, to be a woman. She also was buried with 3 horses. And again, this is the area where the Scythians were. I'm going to talk about the Scythians a lot in a bit. So I think it's fair to say that this woman was not only very important, you don't get buried with this much wealth because you are a random bystander, but also probably somebody who had quite a lot of martial prowess, or at least to whom the idea of martial prowess was very important. So jumping back to what I was talking about before, about the Ice Age, there is this deep entrenched idea, I think, when we think about prehistory, of man the hunter and woman the gatherer. And this is one of those ideas that's been perpetuated forever. There isn't a lot of evidence for it. People might argue some ethnographic things, but I don't think that there's a very strong argument to say we know what gender roles were like in the prehistoric period. And this particular discovery made waves, I think 2 years ago now. This was a grave from up in the Andes in South America, circa 7000 BCE. And what they found was a body buried with 20 stone projectile points, which you can see some of them here, as well as other sort of hunting tools, and the bones of big game, primarily vicuna, which are these things you see in the reconstruction, sort of camelid llama things. And again, the body is female. And this was huge news when it broke, because there is this assumption that women don't hunt in prehistory, but why wouldn't they? There's no reason a woman can't use an atlatl like she's doing in this picture. And when you start to actually look at the bones and do this sort of sex estimation or DNA analysis to look at these things, they're finding more and more of these assumptions to be false. Her grave is not unique, by the way. They found quite a few female hunter graves, what were designated as female hunter graves, on this excavation. Really interesting site. Hers was by far the most spectacular, though. Look at those stone points. They are absolutely stunning. So we're going to go from Ice Age South America to Italy in the 6th century BCE. This is an Etruscan tomb. Finding a unrobbed Etruscan tomb is a really big deal. It was found in 2013. The Etruscans were the forerunners to the Romans in Italy. They quite impressive metal workers. They very much provided the basis for a lot of Roman traditions as well. And when this tomb was found, they actually thought they knew exactly who was in it. So on this side, you've got a body nicely laid out. There's a spear. And at the foot of the body, there's this beautiful bronze bowl full of burnt offerings. And there was this, which most of the site reports list as a jewelry box. Now, interestingly, when they x-rayed it, it was not a jewelry box. I'm getting ahead of myself. Whoops. More ways than one, apparently. And on this side, there was a cremation. And so all the initial press releases say, warrior prince found, and they speculate which warrior prince it is. They have sort of records about the king lines of the Etruscans in this area. And they assumed that the cremation was some kind of concubine or wife. Now they did some osteological analysis, and as I'm sure you've worked out already, because it's part of this talk, this body, the one with the spear, not a man, female. The cremation was male though, which is interesting. And this jewelry box, when they x-rayed it, actually looks like it held sewing equipment because it's got a bunch of needles inside. And the other thing about this jewelry box / sewing kit is it's made of an old shield boss. Now, the Etruscans were masters of metalwork. Etruscan metalwork, I think, actually is some of the finest in the ancient world. There is no reason to reuse a shield boss to make this box, unless they're doing so intentionally. This is not a case of, we have this thing and bronze is expensive, so we'll just reuse it. This is something that's been an intentional choice that's been made, probably for some sort of symbolic reason. And one of the things that was really interesting about this tomb as well is the way the site reports changed when they did the osteological analysis, because all the original site reports talk about the spear that was with the body as a sign of martial prowess, of virility, very masculine, this man must have been a hunter and a warrior. Once they did the osteological analysis, the spear became a symbol of unity. I'm not really sure how a spear is meant to be a symbol of unity, but that was the official analysis. And it's interesting to see how emotional and upset people get every time one of these tombs is discovered, and people talk about how perhaps warfare was not entirely a masculine pursuit. So Alexander the Great had a half-sister. Bet you didn't know that. Not only did he have a half-sister, she led armies. She was quite impressive. Her name was Cyne. She had the same dad as Alexander the Great, and her mother was an Illyrian queen. Now, Illyria, which is sort of here on the map, is part of the area where you get the sort of nomadic horse cultures of the steppe that the Scythians, the Sarmatians, I'm going to talk about, that are the inspiration for the Amazons in Greek mythology. Now, women fighting in Greece is not really a thing. The Greeks had very strong opinions on gender roles. But Alexander the Great's sister is one of only 3 women to have fought in the first, that we have record of, I should say, that we have record of fighting in the front lines during the Hellenistic period of Macedonia. And she held her own. When Alexander died, she actually made a bid to get part of the territory. She lost. And Polonius tells us that she intentionally went into a battle she knew she would lose, because she would rather die a warrior than, live as a sort of closeted woman forced into the domestic sphere. Now, you have to think about biases when you look at written accounts, but it's certainly interesting. The other thing that's interesting is Polonius records that she slew the queen of the enemy, that Cyne slew the queen of the Illyrians, which implies that the queen of the Illyrians was also fighting at this time. So we do have some record of women fighting in, 4th century BCE. Now, female gladiators. So gladiators, if you have ever seen the fabulous Russell Crowe movie, are people in the Roman Empire who used to fight for the entertainment of the masses. It was a mix of slaves and freedmen. There was a lot of variation what went on in the arena. Some people fought animals, some people fought each other. Sometimes the arena was used for executing criminals. Now, the question of female gladiators is kind of a controversial one in archaeological circles. I'll lay out the evidence we have. So the most convincing evidence we have is this inscription, which is from Halicarnassus in Turkey, depicting a fight between two women that we are told are called Amazon and Ancilla. Apparently they drew. And we know that they're women because of the way their names are denoted. Greek is a very gendered language. They've got short hair though, which is interesting. We have this statuette from the 1st century CE, which has what has been interpreted as a female gladiator holding up a curved dagger in a sign of victory. There are lots of statues and depictions of male gladiators doing this. This is the only one we have of a woman. And again, there are arguments about whether or not that's what it's actually depicting. I think it is. I'm pretty convinced. But history and archaeology in particular is very hard. Now we have a couple of literary accounts about female gladiators, but they're not from histories. Is the thing. They're mainly from stories and plays. And so it's quite hard for us to pick apart whether or not they're reflecting something that's actually happening or if they're just dramatic plot devices. But interestingly, Septimus Severus passes a law when he's emperor prohibiting women from fighting each other in the arena. I think that's possibly the most convincing bit of evidence because you don't outlaw things that aren't happening. So while it was probably never a particularly common occurrence, it must have been happening enough for him to feel that they needed a law about it, right? And again, just to look at how ambiguous evidence is and how difficult it can be, let's look at this up here. This is a beautiful oil lamp from a grave found in London. I believe it's 2nd century. It was found in Suffolk. It's the Great Dover Street burial. It was a cremation, quite wealthy, found with lots of gladiator sort of accoutrements, including this lamp. We know that the cremation was female. And that's about the one thing everyone can agree on. Half the site reports say that she must have been a female gladiator, given all the sort of gladiator themed stuff she was buried with. And then the remaining ones, there's one quarter that says she must have been the lover of a gladiator. And there's one quarter that says she must have just been a super gladiator fangirl. She's clearly involved with the arena somehow. She's really into it. She's buried with, strigula. She's got these lamps with gladiators on. But it's very hard to prove why, And because it's a cremation, we don't have the opportunity we do with, say, that Armenian woman or the Romanian burial I was talking about, where we can look at the bones and go, these wounds are indicative of somebody living a violent lifestyle. Now, women fighting in the Roman Empire would have been certainly not the proper thing that proper ladies did, but that isn't to say that it never happened. Again, we have from Cumbria in Britain 2 cremations in a soldier's graveyard that indicates there might have been some women in the auxiliary of the Roman army up there, which is interesting. They look to have been from the steppe, probably Scythians. They're, again, both cremations. They're buried with weapons, and they're buried with the ashes of horses, which is curious because that's not a very normal Roman practice, but it is a very normal Scythian practice to be buried with one's horse. So it's possible that there were women in the Roman army in Britain sort of around the same time, a little earlier, that Septimus Severus is making this law about female gladiators, which is interesting. Right, so enough about the classical world. Let's talk about the Vikings. Everybody loves the Vikings, right? Now, this tomb at Boudicca, quite an old find. We've known about it for a long time. It's really, really well appointed, right? His body was buried with 2 horses, a mare and a stallion, an axe, a sword, a spear, armor, piercing arrows, a battle knife, 2 shields, and a board game, amongst other things. So no matter what type of fight this individual was getting ready for, they were ready. They had every weapon sort of known to Vikings. And it's a very rich grave. There's a lot of very shiny things in it. And the really interesting thing is the board games, because while gaming pieces and game boards are not entirely unheard of in Viking burials, they're really strongly associated with military leaders, particularly with boat burials. This is not a boat burial, it's a wooden chamber underground, but it shares a lot of things with the boat burial. Now, for years and years and years, the Boudicca burial was the subject of many academic papers about how it was the archetypical Viking warrior grave. A lot of people wrote about it. In, I think, 2018, an osteologist looked at the bones, and as it happens, that body is female. Now, we have records of shield makings in Viking sagas, and we have the Valkyries in Viking mythology. But people got real upset about this being a female burial, to the point where there were actually accusations that the osteologist that conducted the study looked at the wrong bones, which is quite a serious accusation in the archaeological world. So again, it's a really interesting example in how invested people are in our narratives of gender roles in the past. This is not the only female Viking warrior grave, by the way. They're not super common. This is definitely the most famous example, but the more we go back and look through these old excavations and actually start to reassess, the more we realize the circular logic of being buried with a weapon means you're a man, and therefore all men are buried with weapons, doesn't work, and that we need to start approaching this question differently. Right, so I've saved the best for last. I love the Scythians. The Scythians are the coolest ancient civilization, and I don't know why we don't talk about them more. So the Scythians, and also the Sarmatians and the Illyrians, and a couple of other tribes of the Russian steppe, right? They are a nomadic horse riding people. They're around from about 600 BCE to about 500 CE. They have an interesting reputation in classical texts. They are known for wearing bright colors, riding around in their horses, being very barbaric, wearing trousers, which is the height of barbaric in the classical world, being excellent archers. They're always depicted with these great hats, and they had tattoos, and their women drank as much as their men, and their women fought. What's with that? So Herodotus actually writes that these are the descendants of the Amazons. There's this brilliant origin story he writes. Now, I would be the last person to tell you that Herodotus is a 100% trustworthy source for the ancient world, but he is an ancient Greek man writing about what the cultural views of the Greeks were at the time. So it's quite funny that there's this story about shipwrecked Amazons who, through some shenanigans, end up sleeping with Scythian men, getting pregnant, and then refusing to give the Scythian men the kids because they've seen how the Scythians, these tribes are treating their women, and they go, no, we're not doing that. You're going to give us equal rights. We're going to hunt. We're going to fight. We're going to ride around on our horses and terrorize everybody. And the Scythians just went, yeah, sure. And thus the civilization was born. I think my favorite detail actually about Herodotus's story is not the ridiculous pantomime shenanigans that go into the Amazons getting the Scythian tribesmen to sleep with them, but actually the fact that he mentions it is the custom of these people, now that the Amazons are integrated into them, obviously, explaining why their women fight, that no virgin shall wed until she slays a man of the enemy. I mean, talk about harsh dating criteria. It's not no dating till you're 16. It's no dating until you've gone out and murdered someone. So I've already mentioned that I don't actually think much of Herodotus as a source. So let's look at the actual archaeology, because that's my jam. So this is a map of the area. This whole steppe area is covered by many, many nomadic equestrian tribes. They tend to all get lumped together. I'm guilty of doing this. I'm going to say the Scythians. It's a bit like talking about the Celts. It's a catch-all term that refers to lots of people that probably would have had individual identities as small tribes. But it's hard for us to know that because they didn't write things down. When the Greeks write about the Amazons, they always put them in this area of the world. They talk about them on the shores of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So between the fact that that's where they're located, and between the fact that in most Greek art, the Amazons are wearing these very typical hats that we know are Scythian hats, we're pretty certain that the Amazons were inspired by the Scythians. And as Herodotus says, the Scythians are descended from Amazons, which is why they let their women fight. So we know about them primarily through their graves. Funerary archaeology is a good way to look at these things, as we've discussed. And this is a very interesting one from Tuva, Russia. Like I said, with all of the others, when this was discovered, they thought it was a man. Well, specifically, they thought it was a boy because this body is between 12 and 13 years old, which interestingly means you can't do sex estimation using the bones because you have to have been through puberty to do that. But they did some DNA analysis. DNA preserved really well. In fact, this body was partially mummified due to the fact that the Russian climate allows for permafrost. So they know that she had a wart on her face. And because they were able to do the DNA testing, they proved that she was a woman. She was buried with lots of weapons, as you can see here. She's got arrows, she's got a bow, she's got spears, she's got what looks like a battle axe. Again, her body very much bears the sorts of signs that you would expect for somebody who's doing a lot of riding and a lot of archery. She also has one of the little leather caps, which is very hard. I couldn't find an unblurry photo. I'm really sorry. You can just see it there. And so clearly for the Scythians, being buried with weapons was a big deal. And we actually find that 1/3 of all women in this sort of area are in this period are buried with weapons and have signs on their bones of having led violent lives. So it's pretty well accepted that the women of the steppe were fighting with the men, which makes sense. If you have a nomadic horseback society, you can't put half your population behind a wall and tell them to hide there till it's safe. It doesn't work. Now, the Scythians were a pretty successful civilization. They lasted a long time, and a lot of their graves are incredibly wealthy. So this is a tomb from Russia again. All of the news outlets said 3 generations of warrior women buried together. Now, I could not find any evidence that they'd done any sort of DNA analysis to assess whether or not these 3 women were related, but there are certainly 3 women buried in this tomb, and they do seem to be an older individual, a sort of middle-aged individual, and a younger individual. 2 of them were buried explicitly with weapons, daggers, spears, bows, arrows. You can actually see in this picture, you've got the top of the spear there and the shaft would have been there. It looks like she probably would have been holding it. Now, what's very interesting about this, let's look at her legs. She's been buried as if she's on a horse. So again, it just goes to show horses were really important to these people. And there were horse remains in this tomb, as there are in most Scythian tombs. And I do find it interesting, as somebody who also horseback rides, that when I was researching warrior women, there does seem to be a huge link between equestrian equestrianism and horse riding and warrior woman, but that could just be that horses were quite good warfare technology in the past. And she's got, as well, one of the bodies has this beautiful, beautiful crown with the really nice inlaid gold work. So these are wealthy, powerful people. And much like the Etruscan tomb, there is a combination of grave goods that we would consider traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine. As you can see, this woman's got a mirror with her. She's got jewelry, this one. You know, there's no rigid sort of boundary, like, for instance, the Victorians would have expected. They would have been very confused as to why there is a mirror in a man's tomb, and they would have assumed that this spear belonged to the body, but the mirror maybe belonged to somebody else, which is a ridiculous way of looking at it. We need to divorce ourselves from our assumptions. So, I have mainly talked about the Iron Age and antiquity because that is the period that I, as an archaeologist, study. And because I'm much more comfortable using archaeological material than I am textual material. But there is really no period in history where you cannot find at least one exception of a woman taking the battlefield. In the medieval period, you've got Joan of Arc in the 15th century, who's leading, you know, the French to war in the 100 Years' War. You've got Eleanor of Aquitaine, who literally led a crusade. In the 17th century, you've got this woman. This is Julie d'Aubigné. I highly recommend looking her up if you are interested in sort of dueling culture and 17th century. She was an amazing duelist. She killed 10 men in a duel. She was also just an opera singer. So she was this hugely notorious figure who broke a lot of boundaries in what was expected of her and was considered one of the best swordsmen in France. This is Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were both hugely successful pirates in the 18th century, in the golden age of piracy. Anne Bonny, in fact, managed to escape being hung by being pregnant, and just went right back to piracy when they let her out, by the way. Did not stop her. We have tons of examples from the American Civil War of women who dressed up as men to fight. Harriet Tubman was a general for the Union. In World War II, the Russians had an all-female bombing squad called the Night Witches. There are tons of female snipers. I believe the sniper with the most confirmed kills in World War II is, again, a Russian woman. If you look hard enough, there are women in the narrative. We have always been there, and I suspect we always will be there. Sometimes it's just a matter of putting aside our preconceived notions and knowing where to look. So thank you very much. That's my talk, and I will happily take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So much interesting stuff you put out there. It was a wonderful, huge, wide-ranging look at a fascinating topic. Thank you. Just quickly, while it's still fresh in the mind, you mentioned the woman Julie, somebody,
Julie d'Aubigné.
Can you spell that so we can?
Do you want just the last name, or do you want her full name?
Well, it's Julie, right? Okay.
Yeah, and then D''Aubigny.
I-D-N-Y?
I-G-N-Y. And she's absolutely amazing. Very scandalous.
Thank you.
I should say some of her exploits include breaking her girlfriend out of a convent and then setting it on fire. But she is absolutely one of my favorite historical figures.
I'm definitely looking her up. Thank you. I'll put that name into the chat as well. We have a couple questions already. Liz wanted to know a little bit more about the Etruscan tomb that you talked about. When did that excavation happen and the osteological examination happen?
Also, I believe in 2013. Often it is quite normal for press releases to happen when you finish an excavation, but before you've done the post-excavation analysis, which can take years depending on funding.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Spartan women were, this is from Donald, Spartan women were known to have a lot more freedom than other Greek women. They exercised and did sports, but as far as I know, no hoplites. Any advice, any information on that? And you have to tell us what a hoplite is.
A hoplite is a type of Greek warrior. Hoplite warfare was what was going on for most of the sort of Hellenistic period. You've got a shield, you've got a spear, and you have a sort of shield line. We don't have any examples of Spartan women warriors, but we do have a couple of stories about Sparta being attacked while the men were away and the women repelling invaders. So I would say that there is certainly literary evidence of Spartan women being able to hold their own. But Greek society, even Sparta, which was a lot better than the rest of it, had very strict gender roles.
Thank you. Thank you. One thing I was curious about myself, you mentioned early on that we know that women made cave art. How do we know that?
So from what I understand of the papers, and I will admit, the Paleolithic is really not my time period. They've done some statistical analysis on the shape and size of the hands. And they know that some of it was done by children, some of it was done by women.
Purely from hand size.
Yeah, well, and shape, but yes.
All right.
Again, statistical analysis, put numbers in, get answers out. Again, I'm not entirely convinced by it, but it is an interesting study.
Thank you. CJ wants to know, could you please spell the name of the Romanian grave? Asking for a friend, she says. He says.
AGIGHIOL.
AGIGHOIL. Okay.
And there's a wonderful book. Hold on, let me just look up the title of it that I used for a lot of the research on this, that has more details on that grave. And if people want to learn more, it's a good book to read. It goes into a lot more detail about the historical stuff, which is not my comfort zone. So I talked about less than the archaeological, which is The Amazons, Lives and Legends of Warrior Women Across the Ancient World by Adrienne Mayer. And she goes, again, individually into the different strands of evidence we have for warrior women.
Thank you. I want to say, if anyone else has more questions, this is a good time to type them into Q&A. I wanted to ask also about the current interest in warrior women. I mean, why did you pick this topic? And do you think that there's a resurgence perhaps of interest? Maybe it's based entirely on Game of Thrones, I don't know. But
I mean, I've always been very interested in it because, like I said, I've been doing some form of fencing for most of my life. And it is a very, again, particularly when I did reenactment, a very common thing that was leveled at me that I should get back into the kitchen. So I've always been interested in it. And Boudicca was one of the big reasons I got interested in the British Iron Age, because it was one of the first times I had seen a depiction of a warrior woman in history. I can remember my mum telling me about her when I was quite young and being really like, oh, you mean the biggest rebellion was led by a woman? Just that blowing my tiny little mind. I chose to do it now because I think it's an interesting topic. And I think that in the last couple of years, there have been a lot of news stories about it and about people starting to re-examine these old graves and finding that it's women. And it's been really interesting to watch the reactions, because a lot of people seem to have a lot of stakes in these graves must be male and get really upset. Some of the accusations I've seen, the Boudicca one of looking at the wrong bones, there's been accusations of contaminating DNA, there's been accusations of fabricating evidence. People get really worked up about this. And I think it's interesting that people are so threatened by the idea that we might be wrong. We're wrong in archaeology all the time. We are constantly learning and reassessing as we get better technology and better ways of analyzing things.
Right, thanks. Monique says, awesome chat. Which was your favorite warrior group and why?
So I love the Scythians. I knew almost nothing about the Scythians before researching this talk. I sort of vaguely knew who they were, but I certainly, it's not the area of the world I work in. It's not the time period I work in. I'd never really looked at it. And man, they're amazing. First of all, there's quite good evidence of gender parity. They absolutely fascinating, really successful civilization, but didn't necessarily have the big built cities that we associate with the classical world. But that didn't mean they couldn't hold their own. And they had tattoos. We have like these permafrost mummies, right, from Russia, and they have awesome tattoos. Their clothing is really colorful, and I love that we can reconstruct them. And there's such a departure from sort of how we view the past, particularly the classical period. You can see in this reconstruction on my slide here, you know, she's got this beautiful patterned clothing. She's got the hat. It's just astounding what we're finding.
And can you also tell us a little bit about your current research?
So I specialize in the British Iron Age and Roman invasion, 200 BCE, well, 100 BC to 200 CE, but that might be extended. And I am looking specifically at human and animal bodies that are found in places you wouldn't, or positions. There's a lot of intentional positioning, especially with the animals, that you wouldn't expect. And I'm trying to work out the sort of process that went into creating these deposits and maybe why they're doing it. Because it is a bit weird to find 56 chopped up humans in the bottom of a quarry pit surrounded with over 100 dogs, but hey ho, we did. So it's just trying to get to the bottom of that.
And where was that particular pit you mentioned?
That is in Surrey in a place called Yule, and that's my first sample. So it's on my mind. In fact, I mentioned it. I gave a talk last year for Glencoe Library, which is on the YouTube page, on ritual in the Iron Age, where I do talk specifically about that site and more about my research.
Right, thank you. Got a question from Paul. And he says, are you aware of Japanese feudal society where women were trained to fight? Although there were gender separations in terms of weapons and roles, however, they were expected to defend themselves and their homes while the army was away. Or is it the case that this is outside the scope of this talk, as in it was post-antiquity?
What is post-antiquity? And also, I know very little about non-European archaeology. It is a huge gap in my knowledge, but I'm certainly going to go away, Paul, and research that because it sounds really cool.
Yes, it does. Perhaps next time. I think we are at the end of our questions now. Let me just check. Oh, wait a minute. Here's some more. Sorry. Donald asks, do you think that there's an association between horse cultures and the prevalence of women warriors from those cultures?
I think that mounted combat is very different from combat on the ground. And I think that it eliminates, especially if you're doing horseback archery, it's not about who's the strongest physically. It's going to be about who's the fastest and most technically skilled. And so I do think it eliminates a lot of the more stereotypical arguments for why the battlefield is only a place for men. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the Scythians, whose entire battle strategy is about archery and horseback riding, have much greater gender parity than, say, the Greeks, who rely on line fighting and very much physical strength, as opposed to things, you know, the sort of hit and run tactics that you're getting in the Russian steppe.
Thank you. Stacy wonders if you have any information on the Dahomey, Dahomey.
I do not. I will look that up as well.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy, for bringing that up. And Anne, an end that you know rather well, Ellen, asks, there was a piece of pottery at the beginning of a woman wearing what looked like a modern unitard. Do you have any info on that?
So we know from the Scythian graves that they wore trousers and close-fitting shirts, which is what I think that's meant to be depicting, and that they were often striped, spotted, decorated. The Scythians liked patterns. I think the fact it looks like a unitard is probably more of a function of ancient Greek art styles than a depiction of it actually being a unitard. But trousers were, again, not a thing in the classical world, really. You know, the Romans and Greeks are really skeptical of the whole idea because they don't do a lot of equestrian stuff. And honestly, trousers, you invent trousers if you ride horses. You're not riding a horse in a tunic and nothing else. That's going to really hurt if you're doing it all the time. So.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Ellen Green, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, from both sides of the Atlantic. I think we have some people watching from Europe as well as from the United States, possibly Canada. So thank you very much. So interesting. And we'll look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everyone.